Today's video, we're going to be checking out the Mattel DC Comics Multiverse. This is Super Friends Superman. Let's figure out how tall the Man of Steel is by grabbing a tape measure. The figure stands at 6.5 inches in height. For displaying options, he comes with a very snazzy Super Friends display bottom that we've also seen with both Batman and Green Lantern. And you've also got this slightly chromium card featuring some very classic 80s Superman artwork here. You spin it around, on the back side you've got Fry. That will make up Super Friends when we eventually get them all put together. The cards are consistent to one another, as all the Super Friends have come included with their own corresponding cards. Just to show you what I mean by that, there is Superman's stand. Somewhat ironic at that point of saying that, the figure would topple over. There we go. We've already had a look at Green Lantern. There was Green Lantern's card. And I believe the first one we looked at was Batman. There we go. Still have to have a look at Aquaman, but I was lucky enough that both Aquaman and Superman I found at my local comic book store. It seemed to take forever between the releases of these two and the releases, or eventually me finding Superman and Aquaman. So finally, super stoked to get those all put together. You can also go ahead and spin them around, and you spell per friend, Z, which if you now take, I guess Aquaman would be right here as sup, you would fill yourself out Super Friends. Only I guess 4 figures are going to be released in this line. Strange that Wonder Woman gets avoided. Technically you could say Flash gets avoided too, but I would probably put Wonder Woman in the mix before I would put a Flash, because we've gotten so many Flashes over the course of the multiverse releases. Very, very few Wonder Woman, making use of course, the original mold. So I would have loved to see Wonder Woman. Apparently it wasn't in the cards. Literally, it wasn't in the cards. Oh, by the way as well, we can put Superman on his base here. Something I will talk about in a second. Also bringing in Batman. I'm certain I looked at Batman first. Knowing me, knowing you, that was an ABBA song. I probably would have looked at Batman first, then Green Lantern. But here are the 3 characters that we've gotten so far under the Super Friends banner. I'm putting it all in quotations, which again, all make use of original DC Universe molds. Nothing different. No retooling, which is slightly disappointing. Needless to say, we'll move these guys out of the way because we've already had a look at reviews of those. A shameless plug as well, if you haven't had a chance to check out my reviews of those, feel free. Go check it out. Going back to the Superman stand, as nice as the stand may be, and nice that they've put Super Friends on the bottom here, I'm certain that they've used this base from something before. The reason why I say that is Superman has absolutely no chance. The base must be made from kryptonite because Superman does not want to adhere to it at all. The peg is way too small for the peg hole on Superman's foot. As a result, he sort of just sits on top of the peg rather than actually attaching to the peg. It would have been just as beneficial if they had just left the peg completely off, because that's ultimately what you're just doing. I suppose the peg slightly lines Superman up, but it does not stay in place at all, which is, again, a bit of a shame. Okay, so we'll put Superman right there. We get one last look. I'm sure I'll bring it back anyways, but one last look at the display base as we have a look at the Man of Steel. Yes, it was a very long time that I had to wait to get these. I kept checking the Walmarts where I went and got the Batman and the Green Lantern initially, and for some strange reason, they just didn't stock Superman or Aquaman, or I guess they're now finally releasing to stores. It's a long wait for ultimately what ends up being just a re-release of an existing Superman. Case in point, let me just move this Superman right over, and I'll bring in the original Superman from DC Universe that he is based from. It's really a night and day comparison when you look at the color scheme. This has really been removed considerably to give us a more simplified color scheme, something that you would expect to find in the cartoon itself. But it's interesting that the Superman face, as much the face I don't really care for to start off with, gets progressively worse as you add or remove for that matter, remove more paint from it. So let's have a look at the two figures. Obviously the big notable exception as well is that if you flip them around, the Superpowers capes are cloth rather than plastic, which some would consider an upgrade. It ultimately means, though, that it's using a C-clip to clamp itself around the neck of Superman, and ultimately making Superman look like he has a collar, kind of like Doctor Strange. And so therefore the cape doesn't really sit right. It obviously looks as if, too, the cape is not attached to anything. It literally looks like it's been pegged to Superman or clipped to Superman's neck. Showing you the comparison, though, between the two faces. These are the same faces. It's interesting that I hated this head sculpt so much on this particular Superman, and yet ultimately seeing it in comparison to a very stark removal of paint on this one, I actually grow more fonder now of this Superman head sculpt. But it is actually the exact same Superman. Missing considerably are the additional blue on the hair, the white of the eyeballs there. But still there is the very obvious square jaw, which looks even actually worse on this Superman than it does on this one right here. This definitely has a lot more paint to it. Definitely also has a lot of a darker costume going for it, relying more on like navy blues, whereas this one comes across more like almost like a turquoise blue. A reasoning I've also noticed as well, throughout the course of casting this guy, I've noticed that the lower legs are a different blue than the legs here, the top area of the legs, and like the arms aren't the same color as the torso. It's very, very small. You almost barely notice it, but you probably will notice the legs more so as being the off color to the rest of his body. Everything else basically, like I said, is just lighter shades. This really skimps back on the coloring, but again, it's supposed to look more like the cartoon, so it makes sense that, well, Superman here is a little bit more primary in color. Dang nabbit, though, I didn't realize how much more I would now like this Superman as a result of it. It's kind of like being in a very painful relationship, or at least what you think is a relationship that you want to get out of, and then you date, perhaps you find other individuals far, far worse than the person that you were going out with, and then you realize afterward, maybe it wasn't so much them, it was me. Oh, that's awfully deep. I now appreciate this Superman much more now, as now comparing it to the slightly degraded version of Superman here. It's not to say that this is a bad figure by any stretch of the imagination, but it definitely does feel very simplified. The Superman emblem is also considerably different. This one relying on more broader outlines than this one right here, which uses the thinner outlines. But it's interesting that one mold could be so drastically different from one another simply by just changing the paint. It almost also seems like this face is a little bit more slender, and also that the chin is much more defined on this Superman than this one right here. And I think probably what's killing it too is the collared, the cape clip there, which, because it's riding so far up on Superman, it does make his jawline look much more angular than it actually is. The articulation on this guy, it seems so far like quite a negative review, but it really shouldn't be. His head rotates all the way around, although through doing that you will notice that the cape will go along with it. Hinge joints on the arms will allow the arms to move outward. Rotation all the way around. A swivel on the bicep, hinge on the elbow, and swivel on the hands. Upper torso crunch. He also has a waist swivel. And anybody familiar with DC Universe figures will recognize the hinge joint here on the legs right away. This one is a lot stiffer than this one right here. Also allows the legs to move forward and back. Swivel, a very loose swivel on the lower cut of the thigh. A hinge, single hinge on the knee. And just a straight hinge on the foot. I can't say that I dislike this figure. It has attributes to it that I like that perhaps that the original mold didn't have. Case in point, it has the lighter shades of the blue, which for being specifically a Super Friends Superman, it makes more sense for it to be actually this lighter shade than the darker blue that we got with the other one. Also digging the cloth cape, which I think is a nice touch as well. It kind of makes it feel more like an older figure. Still, ultimately, though, for all of that, kind of like what I felt with the Green Lantern, I wish that the head sculpt had been changed. For really what little Mattel had to do with the rest of the body, it's essentially making use of the exact same body as all the other DC Universe figures, for the most part, that we've gotten. All they've really done is just given us a new cape and a lighter shade of paint. For the merits of, let me just move it over here for a second, and get him to hopefully stand. There we go. If we bring in the packaging, I would love for them, if anything, just to have retooled a new head sculpt. Something like a smiling Superman. And still, ultimately, what we end up getting is a mold I didn't care for before, and yet, strangely, now comparing it to the Superpowers version, I actually find myself liking the original one a lot more than I did before. So, fancy that. There are, despite what may have sounded during the course of this review, some merits to picking up these particular figures. I loved the fact that they do have lighter color schemes, especially with the Superman, the Batman, and what we looked at so far, the Green Lantern, all have lighter, more cartoon sort of color schemes. This Superman, unlike the original mold that we were comparing in the course of this video, this one resonates a little bit more, feeling as if not only it was an older vintage figure, kind of felt more like a Superpowers figure, which I like a lot as well. Also would have been cool if they had to add some additional accessories, maybe like a mock kryptonite ring that would have been re-released, or included, I guess, in the re-released Superpowers Superman. I think that came out in the DC Comics or DC Heroes line later on. It's not a bad looking figure. I kind of wish that they could have reused or made use of a new head sculpt instead of relying on the one that we had before. The one that we had before wasn't terrible, but taking away all the aspects of the paint, I find that the head sculpt worsens for this figure than it did with the original release. Still, for a more recent released Superman, if you can't find, for example, the original DC Universe figure Supermans, maybe this is a good figure to pick up. And of course, it's also got the benefit of having the more lighter color scheme, which is not something we've seen a lot with the previously released Superman figures from DC Universe. So I'm kind of on the fence. Part of me likes this figure for the lighter shades of color, the more kind of simplified color scheme. And the other half of me still resents the fact that we couldn't have gotten a new head sculpt, which is really at the very list of what needs to be retooled for a figure, one of the more least expensive routes to go, because you're really only having to resculpt a head. Everything else can kind of really stay the same. So I wish a new head could have been incorporated with the Man of Steel here. Today, though, we were having a look, finally. Wow, took forever for this figure to be released. We were looking at the Mattel DC Comics Multiverse. This was the Super Friends Superman. We're going to have a look at the Aquaman in the next video, so stay tuned for that. If you haven't had a chance to hit that little subscribe button down below, make sure you do so. Like I said, more videos. Specifically, Aquaman will be coming next, but after that, more videos will be coming as well. So always lots of new content coming to this channel. See you guys next time.